You ever notice how the quiet ones never explain themselves? The security camera mounted above the diner door caught it first, the faint tremor in the glass as a line of motorcycles rolled into the gravel lot. Engines low and heavy, like distant thunder that hadn't decided whether to storm or pass. 20 minutes later, that same camera would record something no one inside would ever forget. But right now, the afternoon sat in a fragile kind of calm, broken only by the slow hum of an old pickup cooling in the sun and the soft chime of the diner door. Opening as Arthur Hayes stepped inside, his cane touching the worn tile floor with a steady, measured rhythm that didn't ask for attention and didn't need it. He was dressed simply, a faded olive jacket, jeans that had seen better years, and a pair of boots polished not for show, but out of habit, the kind of habit that never leaves a man no matter how many decades pass. A few heads turned, not because of who he was, but because of what people assumed he wasn't. A quiet old man, maybe late 70s, moving carefully but without hesitation, the kind of presence people overlook until they can't. Outside, the engines cut one by one, the sudden silence almost louder than the noise before it. And then the door opened again, letting in a gust of dry wind and a group of men who carried themselves like they owned whatever space they stepped into, leather vests, heavy boots, laughter that filled the room before they even spoke. Arthur didn't look up. Not immediately. He simply reached the counter, resting one hand lightly beside his coffee as if anchoring himself to something familiar, something constant, while the room subtly shifted around him. One of the bikers noticed him first, not because Arthur stood out, but because he didn't react, and in a room built on noise and presence, that kind of stillness felt almost like a challenge. Chairs scraped, boots thudded softly against the floor, and the air tightened in a way no one could quite explain, like something unseen had just stepped into the space between them. The man leading the group, broad shoulders, a voice already forming into a smirk, tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning Arthur from boots to cane, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't expected to find. Arthur finally lifted his gaze, calm, clear, steady, not defiant, not afraid, just present in a way that didn't invite conversation and didn't need to avoid it either. Somewhere behind the counter, a coffee pot clicked softly against glass, the smallest sound in the room, but it carried, because everything else had gone just quiet enough for people to start noticing things they hadn't a moment ago. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing dust across the lot, rattling the diner's window just enough to make the hanging sign sway. And if anyone had been watching closely, really closely, they might have noticed that Arthur's hand, resting on the cane, wasn't tense, wasn't braced, but relaxed, like a man who had already seen how this moment would end long before anyone else realized it had even begun. The man with the broad shoulders stepped closer, his boots slow and deliberate against the tile, not rushed, not uncertain, just measured in a way that suggested he expected the room to adjust around him. And for a moment, it did. Conversations thinning into whispers, forks pausing midair, eyes drifting without wanting to be caught staring. He stopped just short of Arthur's shoulder, close enough that the faint scent of gasoline and leather carried between them, and he leaned slightly, not aggressive, not yet, but intrusive enough to test the boundary that Arthur had not set and did not seem interested in defending. "You in the wrong place, old-timer," he said, his voice low but loud enough for others to hear, the kind of tone that invited an audience without asking for one. And a few of the men behind him let out quiet chuckles that spread like ripples through the room. Arthur did not respond, not immediately. He lifted his coffee cup instead, the ceramic warm against his fingers, and took a slow sip, his gaze drifting not to the man beside him, but to the window where the afternoon light stretched long across the parking lot, as if the conversation happening inches away did not quite reach him. The man's smile tightened, just slightly, the kind of subtle shift that only someone paying close attention would notice, because indifference is harder to confront than defiance, and far more unsettling. "Did you hear me?" he asked, a little sharper now, tapping two fingers lightly against the counter near Arthur's hand, not touching him, but close enough to make the point. Still nothing, just the soft clink of the cup returning to the counter, the quiet exhale of someone who had learned long ago that not every voice deserved an answer. Behind the counter, Emily stood frozen for half a second longer than necessary, a dish towel hanging loosely from her hand, her eyes moving from the biker to Arthur and back again. Something in her expression shifting from mild concern to something harder to name, because it was not fear she saw in the old man. And it was not confusion either. It was something steadier, something that did not match the situation unfolding in front of her. One of the younger bikers circled slightly, his gaze dropping to the cane, to the way Arthur's hand rested on it. And he let out a short laugh that felt rehearsed, like he was filling a role he had seen before. "You need help finding your seat?" he said, gesturing toward an empty booth as if offering assistance. But the tone made it clear it was not kindness being extended. Arthur finally turned his head, slow, deliberate, his pale blue eyes meeting the man's for the first time, and there was no challenge in them, no irritation, just a quiet acknowledgement, like he had been expecting this moment and was simply confirming its arrival. "I am exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice even, unhurried, carrying just enough weight to settle into the space between them without rising above it. The words were simple, but they landed differently than expected, not as resistance, but as certainty, and for a brief second, no one moved, as if the room itself was deciding how to respond. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the glass just enough to draw a few glances, and somewhere far down the road, faint and distant, an engine that did not belong to the group in the parking lot began to approach, too far to matter yet, but close enough to be on its way. Emily's fingers tightened around the towel as she slowly reached. Beneath the counter, her movements small, careful, unnoticed by most, except for the one person who seemed to notice everything without looking directly at it. Arthur's gaze shifting just slightly, not toward her hand, but toward the reflection in the chrome napkin holder, where the smallest details had a way of revealing themselves if you knew where to look. The man's smirk lingered, but there was a faint hesitation behind it now, subtle enough that only someone used to reading people would notice, and Arthur noticed everything, not by staring, not by reacting, but by allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was, his hand still resting on the cane, fingers relaxed, unmoving, as if the object itself carried more history than anyone in the room could guess. The younger biker shifted his weight, glancing again at the cane, this time not just seeing it as a prop for an easy joke, but as something older, something worn in a way that did not come from neglect, but from use, real use, the kind that left marks that could not be faked, and he reached out, not to grab it, but to tap it lightly with his knuckle, testing it, like someone knocking on a door they did not understand. The sound was dull, solid, not hollow, and for a brief second, his expression changed, confusion flickering across his face before he masked it with another laugh. Louder this time, trying to pull the attention back in his favor. "This thing looks older than you," he said, glancing over his shoulder for approval that came in scattered chuckles. But the laughter did not carry as far as before. It did not fill the room the same way, because something had shifted, something quiet and heavy that pressed against the edges of the scene. Arthur's thumb moved slightly along the shaft of the cane, tracing over a section where the wood had darkened from years of contact, and for a fraction of a second, the diner disappeared in his mind, replaced by a horizon that stretched wide and empty under a pale sky. The dry wind carrying the scent of dust and metal, the distant hum of rotor blades cutting through the air in steady, rhythmic pulses. He was younger there, stronger, the weight of the same cane not a support, but a tool, modified, reinforced, carrying something hidden beneath its surface that had nothing to do with walking and everything to do with survival, a quiet piece of engineering born from necessity, not comfort. The memory did not linger, it never did. It came and went like a shadow crossing the sun, leaving behind only the stillness that had been forged in those moments. Back in the diner, Arthur lifted his eyes again, not to the man in front of him, but to the reflection in the glass behind the counter, where Emily's movements had slowed to near invisibility, her hand now resting on a small phone pressed low against the counter, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke into it, careful, controlled, repeating a name that seemed to carry more weight than the room could contain. "Arthur Hayes," she said, each word measured, deliberate, as if saying it wrong might change something important, and on the other end of the line, there was a pause, not confusion, not delay, but recognition, the kind that traveled instantly, silently, like a signal passing through layers of command without needing explanation. Outside, the distant engine grew closer, still too far to draw attention from most, but near enough that it no longer blended into the background, and the wind shifted again, pushing a thin layer of dust across the parking lot, brushing against the tires of vehicles that had arrived loud, but now sat quiet, waiting. Inside, the leader's expression hardened, not because of anything Arthur had done, but because of what he had not done, the lack of reaction that made it harder to control the narrative he had started, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal, to reclaim the space he felt slipping. "You think you are funny," he said, but there was no humor in it now, only a need to provoke something, anything, that would restore the balance he was used to. Arthur did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, but as a natural extension of who he was. And when he finally spoke, it was softer than before, steady, certain, the kind of voice that did not rise because it did not need to. "No," he said, his gaze calm, unwavering. "I just know how this ends." The words did not land the way the leader expected, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as something heavier, something final, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air understood that a line had been drawn without anyone raising their voice. The leader straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, eyes narrowing as he searched Arthur's face for something to push against, something to break. But there was nothing there to grab onto. No fear, no anger, no need to prove anything. Just that same quiet certainty that refused to move. One of the bikers shifted behind him, the earlier laughter gone now, replaced by a restless unease that had started small and was beginning to spread, like a low hum no one could quite locate. Outside, the distant engine grew clearer, no longer just a suggestion, but still far enough that it did not interrupt the moment inside. Not yet. Emily's voice, barely audible, faded into silence as she ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone for a second longer before she slowly set it down beneath the counter, her eyes lifting again to Arthur, then to the men around him, measuring something she could not fully explain but could not ignore either. The younger biker who had tapped the cane took a half step back without realizing it, his gaze drifting again to the worn surface, to the faint etching near the handle that caught the light at just the right angle. Not a decoration, not random, but deliberate, precise, a sequence of letters and numbers that meant nothing to him, and yet felt like it should. Arthur's thumb rested there again, covering it, not hiding it, just settling into a place it had rested countless times before, as natural as breathing. The leader let out a short breath through his nose, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, trying to reclaim the rhythm he had started, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he controlled. "You think you know how this ends," he said, his tone edged now, quieter but sharper. "But you are still sitting here, so maybe you do not." And he leaned in just enough to close the distance again, not touching, but close enough to test the boundary one more time. Arthur did not move, not away, not forward. He simply held his ground, his gaze steady. And for a fraction of a second the reflection in the diner window shifted, the light outside changing as something passed across the lot, a shadow that moved with purpose, smooth, controlled, not like the staggered arrival from before, but coordinated, deliberate, the faint crunch of tires on gravel reached the edge of the room, subtle, almost lost beneath the quiet tension inside, but enough to draw a few glances from the tables nearest the window, enough to register as something different. The leader did not notice, not yet, his focus locked on Arthur, waiting for a reaction that never came. Arthur's eyes flicked once, just once, toward the window, not turning his head, just a shift, a confirmation, and then back again, as if checking the time on a clock only he could see. "You are right about one thing," he said, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing it. "I am still sitting here." And he let the words settle, not rushing the next part, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to change its weight. "But not for the reason you think." And outside, the engines that had just arrived did not rev, did not announce themselves. They simply went quiet, one after another, until the only sound left was the wind brushing against the diner windows and the faint, unmistakable click of doors opening in perfect sequence. The sound of the doors outside closing in perfect sequence did not belong to the world the bikers had created when they arrived. It was too controlled, too precise, and it carried a kind of weight that did not need to be loud to be felt. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the attention in the room began to shift away from Arthur and toward the windows, where movement now replaced reflection. Dark shapes passing across the glass with purpose and without hesitation. The leader noticed at last, his focus still locked forward, still trying to hold on to the moment he had started. But even he could not ignore the subtle change in the room. The way conversations had completely died now. The way even the air seemed to settle into something heavier, something expectant. One of the bikers near the door turned his head first, his expression tightening as he caught sight of figures stepping onto the gravel outside, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a calm coordination that made their presence feel larger than their number. No one inside spoke, no one needed to, because something about the way those figures approached made it clear that they were not there by accident, and they were not there to ask questions. Arthur remained exactly where he was, his hand still resting on the cane, his posture unchanged, as if the shift in the room had nothing to do with him and everything to do with something already set in motion long before anyone else realized it. Emily's breath caught softly as she followed the movement outside, her earlier unease now sharpening into recognition, not of who they were exactly, but of what they represented, a kind of authority that did not announce itself with noise or demand attention with force, but simply arrived and took it. The door opened again, slower this time, not pushed wide, just enough to allow the first man to step inside, his presence quiet but undeniable, dressed plainly, no insignia, no display, just a composure that carried years of discipline in every movement. Behind him, others followed, spacing themselves without needing direction, their eyes scanning the room not in suspicion, but in assessment, each detail noted, each position understood. The leader of the bikers straightened fully now, the confidence he had worn so easily beginning to crack at the edges as he took in the scene, trying to place it, trying to understand it, but finding no familiar pattern to hold on to. The younger biker who had laughed earlier stepped back again, this time aware of it, his gaze flicking between the newcomers and Arthur, the connection forming slowly, unwillingly, like a realization he did not want to accept. Arthur finally shifted, just slightly, turning his head toward the entrance, his eyes meeting the first man who had walked in, and for the first time since the moment began, something changed, not in his posture, not in his expression, but in the atmosphere around him, as if the room itself recognized the alignment of something long established. The man at the door paused for half a second, his gaze locking onto Arthur with immediate clarity, no confusion, no hesitation, just recognition, and he took a single step forward. The kind of step that carried meaning beyond movement. Behind him, the others came to a natural halt, not instructed, not signaled, simply understanding without words. The leader of the bikers opened his mouth as if to speak, to reclaim control, to say something that would make sense of what was happening. But no words came, because for the first time since he walked into the diner, the moment no longer belonged to him, and somewhere deep down, he knew it. No one announced who they were. No one needed to, because the silence that followed their arrival carried more authority than any introduction could have, and the man at the front took another step forward, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving Arthur, as if the rest of the room had already faded into the background. The space between them closed not with urgency, but with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you are supposed to be and why. And when he stopped, it was not at a distance of confrontation, but of recognition. "Sir," he said, his voice calm, controlled, carrying a weight that settled over every person in the diner. "We have been trying to reach you." And it was not a question, not a demand, just a statement that landed with quiet finality. Arthur looked at him for a moment, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging something that had always been there, even when it was not visible, and he gave the slightest nod, the kind that would be missed by anyone not watching closely. Behind the man, the others remained still, not rigid, not tense, simply present, their attention outward now, aware of the room, of the bikers, of every detail without making a show of it. The leader of the bikers shifted again, his earlier confidence now replaced by something less certain, something searching, as he looked from Arthur to the man in front of him and back again, trying to understand the connection that had just rewritten the entire moment. "What is this?" he asked, the edge in his voice dulled, not gone, but no longer sharp enough to cut through what had settled in the room. The man did not turn to him, did not acknowledge the question, because it was not directed at the right person, and that, more than anything, made the answer unnecessary. Arthur adjusted his grip on the cane, not to steady himself, but out of habit, and for the first time, he shifted his position slightly, turning just enough to face the man fully, their eye-line level. Despite the difference in posture, "You are early," Arthur said, his voice as steady as before, as if the last 20 minutes had been nothing more than a brief pause in a longer conversation. The man allowed the smallest hint of a smile, not casual, not relaxed, but respectful. "We prefer not to be late," he replied, and there was something in the exchange that made it clear to anyone listening that this was not the first time they had spoken, not the first time this kind of moment had occurred. Emily felt it then, fully, the shift from uncertainty to clarity, not knowing the details, but understanding the weight of what she was witnessing. Her earlier instinct now confirmed in a way that made her stand a little straighter behind the counter, her hands still, her eyes fixed on Arthur with a new kind of respect. The younger biker swallowed, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, the realization settling in pieces, each one heavier than the last, while the leader stood frozen for a fraction too long, his mind catching up to a situation he no longer controlled. Outside, the wind moved through the lot again, quieter now, as if even it had decided not to interrupt what was unfolding inside, and Arthur's eyes moved once more, not to the bikers, not to the room, but back to the man in front of him, the corner of his mouth tightening just slightly, not a smile, not quite, but something close to it, something that suggested the outcome had never been in question at all. The leader tried to laugh, but the sound came out thinner than before, missing the weight it had carried just minutes ago, and he took a step forward as if reclaiming space could somehow reset what had already shifted beyond his control. "All right," he said, forcing a casual tone that did not quite settle. "This has gone far enough." But the words hung awkwardly in the air, not ignored, not challenged, just left without impact, because no one in the room seemed to recognize him as the center of it anymore. The man standing before Arthur did not turn, did not acknowledge him, his focus still anchored where it had been from the moment he entered, and that absence of reaction spoke louder than any confrontation could have. One of the bikers behind the leader shifted again, this time stepping back fully, his boots scraping lightly against the floor, a small sound that carried farther than it should have in the quiet. Arthur's gaze moved briefly toward the reflection in the window once more, catching the alignment of the men who had entered, the way they positioned themselves without blocking exits, without crowding space, just present in a way that suggested control without needing to display it. "You should step outside," the leader said again, this time directing it toward the man in front of Arthur, but the tone had changed, less command, more uncertainty, as if he was testing whether the authority he was used to still applied here. The man finally turned his head, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the voice, his expression calm, unreadable, and when he spoke, it was not louder, not sharper, just precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. "That will not be necessary," he said, and nothing more, no explanation, no escalation, just a boundary set with quiet certainty. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but definitive, like a door closing that no one had seen open. The leader's shoulders tightened, his posture shifting as he recalculated, his eyes flicking between the men now in the room and Arthur, the connection no longer abstract, no longer uncertain, but real, undeniable, and entirely outside his control. Arthur adjusted slightly in his seat, not to rise, not to retreat, just enough to settle more comfortably, as if the moment had reached a point where there was nothing left for him to do except observe it unfold. Emily exhaled slowly behind the counter, her grip on the edge loosening as the tension that had built began to change shape, no longer sharp and unpredictable, but steady, contained. The younger biker lowered his gaze again, this time not out of confusion, but out of understanding, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. Outside, the wind moved through the empty space between the parked motorcycles and the newly arrived vehicles, carrying dust and soft, shifting patterns that brushed against metal and glass without disturbing anything inside. The man in front of Arthur took one final step closer, not invading space, not asserting dominance, but closing the distance in a way that made the connection unmistakable, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but in that room, in that moment, it carried more meaning than anything that had been said so far. Arthur met the gesture with the same quiet acknowledgement, and for the first time since the encounter began, the balance was not shifting, it was settled, firmly, completely, leaving everyone else to simply stand in its presence and understand, whether they wanted to or not, that the outcome had already been decided long before they walked through the door. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the diner like a weight that pressed gently but firmly on everyone inside. And for the first time since the moment began, there was no attempt to fill it, no forced laughter, no sharp remarks, just the quiet understanding that whatever had been unfolding was no longer a confrontation, but a conclusion. The leader stood still, his shoulders squared out of habit rather than confidence, his eyes moving once more between Arthur and the man standing before him, searching for something he could challenge, something he could push against, but finding nothing that responded to the rules he was used to playing by. "Look," he said finally, the word coming slower than before, as if he had to choose it carefully. "We did not know." And it was not an apology, not exactly, but it was no longer a threat either, just an attempt to place himself back into a situation that had already moved past him. The man in front of Arthur did not react. Immediately, he let the words settle, as if giving them the space they needed to reveal what they really were. And then he turned fully, facing the leader now, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and for the first time, his attention shifted away from Arthur, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of the statement that had been made. "That is understood," he said, his voice even, controlled, carrying no judgment, no approval, just clarity, and somehow that made it heavier than if he had raised it. The leader nodded once, quickly, as if accepting something he could not quite define, his hands lowering slightly at his sides, the tension that had built in them slowly releasing, not out of comfort, but out of recognition. Behind him, the younger biker exhaled, a breath he had been holding without realizing it, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, this time not searching for dominance, but for understanding. Arthur remained seated, his posture unchanged, his hand still resting on the cane, but his eyes moved once more, briefly taking in the room, the people, the shift that had occurred without force, without escalation, just through presence and timing. Emily stepped slightly closer to the counter, not intruding, just observing, her earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet certainty that what she had done, the call she had made, had been the right choice, even if she did not fully understand the chain it had set into motion. Outside, the vehicles sat still in the late afternoon light, their presence as quiet as the men who had arrived in them. No flashing lights, no visible authority, just a calm, controlled stillness that mirrored what had settled inside. The man turned back to Arthur, the brief shift of attention complete, and inclined his head once more, a gesture of respect that needed no explanation, and Arthur answered it with the same minimal acknowledgement, the exchange small in movement but immense in meaning. The leader stepped back then, not abruptly, not out of fear, but because there was no longer a place for him in the moment. His earlier position dissolved without confrontation, without being taken, simply no longer relevant. No one told him to leave. No one had to, because the message had already been delivered in a language that did not rely on volume or force, and everyone in the room understood it in the same quiet way. The wind outside softened, the dust settling back onto the gravel as if even it recognized that nothing more needed to be disturbed, and inside, the balance remained exactly where it had shifted, steady, complete, leaving only the echo of what had been and the undeniable presence of what was now understood by all who had witnessed it. No one rushed to leave, and no one needed to be told what to do next, because the moment had already resolved itself in a way that did not require instructions, and the leader stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something else to happen, something louder, something clearer, but nothing came. Only the quiet presence of men who did not need to prove anything in a room that had already understood more than it had witnessed. He gave a small nod, not to anyone in particular, just a reflex, and turned, his boots moving slower now, the confidence that had carried him in replaced by something heavier, something quieter. And one by one, the others followed, not speaking, not laughing, just stepping back into the late afternoon light where their engines waited in silence. The door closed behind them with a soft chime that sounded different now, not like an entrance, but like the end of something that had never fully belonged inside. For a moment, no one moved, the diner holding onto the stillness as if it needed a second to settle, to adjust back to something resembling normal, but normal felt different now. Shifted, quieter in a way that carried meaning. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as she set the towel down on the counter, her eyes returning to Arthur, studying him with a kind of respect that had not been there before, not because he had done anything visible, but because of what he had not needed to do. Arthur reached for his coffee again, the same steady motion as before, lifting the cup, taking a sip, as if the last 20 minutes had been nothing more than a passing moment in a much longer day. The man standing in front of him remained where he was, not lingering, not intruding, just present, and after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice softer now, carrying less command and more acknowledgement. "We can take you back, sir," he said, the offer simple, direct, without pressure. Arthur considered it for a second, his gaze drifting once more toward the window where the light had shifted slightly, the sun lowering just enough to cast longer shadows across the lot. And he shook his head gently, not dismissing, just deciding. "Not yet," he replied, his voice calm, certain. "I have not finished my coffee." And there was something in that answer that made the man incline his head again, accepting it without question, because it was not a preference, it was a choice that carried its own weight. Behind him, the others remained still, understanding the unspoken instruction without needing to hear it, their presence unchanged, steady, patient. Outside, the vehicles waited, engines silent, as if time itself had paused just long enough to accommodate the decision of one man. Inside, the room slowly began to breathe again, chairs shifting slightly, a quiet murmur returning, but softer now, more aware, as if everyone present had learned something they could not quite put into words. Arthur set the cup down gently, his hand resting once more on the cane, his eyes calm, his posture unchanged, and for a brief moment, he looked toward the door, not at the men who had left, but at the space they had occupied, the absence they had left behind. Then he looked back ahead, the same quiet presence settling around him again, unchanged, unshaken, because respect had not arrived with noise or force, it had arrived the same way it always did, quietly, patiently, and when it finally stood in the room, no one questioned it, no one challenged it, they simply understood. Some men do not need to remind the world who they are, because the world remembers for them.